My point is that the force of these campaigns, when set alongside the Western media's appetite for just such bad news stories, and if they can, put race and sex together, all the better, and the lack of attention to non-heteronormative Caribbean subjects as anything other than homophobic victims, I think has severely constrained the terms of the debate. The discourse of rights is framed within the regimes of Western representation that assert its own cultural superiority. And here we have Elephant Man framed as a queen, So this kind of way in which the dancehall gets sucked into the already made narratives of the West about itself. A different meeting point of rights and representations emerges from what are obviously incredibly important and valuable local campaigns against homophobia, which speak in much more locally engaged and sympathetic voices. But for those accessing, say, an organisation like JFLAG from outside the region and not knowing a wider lived context, their emphasis on testimony, and I'll just show you here, this is Outrage, who are obviously the Western group. With the help of Jamaican activists, Outrage has compiled and published a dossier of extracts from key lyrics by all 8 singers who incite the murder of lesbians and gay men. This guide is indispensable tool for journalists and campaigners. So there's this kind of dossier building up, and then JFLAG on their website say, we're always looking for new testimonies. Your story could play a critical role in educating the public. And what I'm arguing really is that those... although we can see the importance and the kind of political kind of thrust of that move, it also inscribes that kind of equivalence between the Caribbean and homophobia and between the Caribbean textuality and homophobia, because it's this idea of testimony that comes forward. I think because homophobia has been made more visible than other aspects of the Caribbean sexual matrix, there has been this loud demand for what's often phrased as a queering of the Caribbean. And I know Kellyanne spoke kind of in quite sophisticated terms about that today, but I guess that idea of actually queering the Caribbean is something, again, that we might want to take pause over, as it usually involves a powerful flow of rhetorics about rights, from the so-called civilised and progressive UK to the slack and backward Caribbean. In other words, the gay emancipation agenda often falls back on very tired and reductive stereotypes about cultural divides that also imply hierarchy. Yet I think, disappointingly, there's been an absence of other footholds into debates around Caribbean sexuality. In her research, which I'm sure a lot of you know, When the Region is a Closet, Tara Atluri offers a candid explanation for her own focus on the dance hall. Popular culture, in the form of dancehall and reggae, seems to be some of the only concrete cultural discourses in which attitudes towards homosexuality are expressed outright. While dancehall and reggae lyrics have come under fire for their crude portrayal of sexual politics, they offer an opening. They are explicit, and while they may be explicitly prejudiced, they do what respectable silences do not. They start the conversation. In a kind of similar gesture to that made by Atluri, Sarah Salih also deploys the Jamaican dancehall as an opener to raising other questions about sexual identities, this time within the wider post-colonial frame. In her editorial to her special issue of Wasafiri called Post-Colonial Queer, which was published in 2007, she begins by invoking Jamaican dancehall as a central provocation for the special issue itself. She says, "The idea for this special issue came to me in 2004 at a time when the violent anti-gay content of a number of Jamaican dancehall lyrics became a focus of critical attention for concerned members of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, queer and human rights communities in Jamaica, the USA and the UK." Salih's special issue includes a wide range of searching scholarship on the issue of post-colonial queer writing. It publishes some wonderful narratives and poems, but none of those are from the Caribbean. The only way the Caribbean is invoked is in this introduction. So the overall effect is to position the Caribbean as the negative frame, the site of impossibility. So my concern as a critic is that none of these models of intervention give space to locally sensitive stories of sexual relations that do not correspond to that idea of cultural impossibility. We might think then that the next place to try would be global queer theory. It sounds as if it might be a good fit. In fact, I think the cultural blindness of UK and US rights-based interventions that I spoke about arguably corresponds to a wider limit point within queer politics in the UK and US, what Eve Sedgwick has called the banalisation of gay and lesbian politics. AIDS is now a managed condition in these societies, there's media visibility, and the market is certainly concerned to court the pink pound and dollar. In a sense, then, it could be argued that it's in travelling outside of the UK and the US that queer studies now finds its energies, its excitements. But is this any more than theoretical tourism? The introduction to queer globalizations opens with a vision of an expanding horizon. Queerness is now global, whether in advertising, film, performance art, the internet, or the political discourses of human rights in emerging democracies. Images of queer sexualities and cultures now circulate around the globe. The increased global visibility of queer sexualities and cultures in the marketplace has also generated multiple opportunities for queer political intervention through an equally globalised coalition politics. Then, a little bit later, and a lot more worryingly, globalization then has provided the struggle for queer rights with an expanded terrain for intervention. Any of us who are post-colonial critics will find our teeth on edge when we read those words, an expanded terrain for intervention. Of course, expansion of their horizon does not actually imply encounter. And while the spread of queer politics is one thing, the opening up or revision of its conceptual repertoire in an encounter with a different culture is quite another. In other words, queer politics may extend itself as it travels without necessarily reflecting on its own norms, without scrutinising the kinds of rights and pleasures that can be secured under its travelling rubric, that almost always journeys from the West to the rest. In other words, it wants to queer other spaces, but it doesn't allow or even make thinkable the idea that other spaces may queer it. So while there's a certain globalised logic as to why queer politics may want to turn to the Caribbean, the more interesting story may be how the Caribbean will turn to queer politics. And this brings me, I guess, to my own thinking at the moment on this subject, which is to return the gaze and argue that we need, instead of queering the Caribbean, to Caribbeanise the queer, to think about Caribbean queer. And there's a lot of confusion, obviously, about how the terms gay and queer relate to each other. And I think there's a lot of good reason for that, because sometimes queer is used as being synonymous with gay. But it's not how I'm thinking about it at all. The queer in my Caribbean queer doesn't mean gay, doesn't actually mean sexual identity at all. It just means a signal of a point of rupture in the way that we categorise identity, both sexual identity but all identities. And I think that's why queer is so important as a term for us to hold on to, precisely because it allows us to read beyond that idea that we are either gay or straight, that those are the only defining options for sexual identity. More than this, it allows us to realise that gay and straight are only one possible idea, one possible theory of sexual identity, even if it's one that's taken a strong hold. It makes visible that these categories are historical inventions mapped onto and not coming from sexual behaviour and preference. Just like the idea of man and of woman, gay and straight are social inventions that are grafted onto us and can never account for all of who we are. So queer then allows us to see our understanding of human sexuality around object choice, which is how we organise it at the moment. You know, our sexuality is defined whether we want to sleep with men or with women, with same-sex or different sex partners. that that actual idea or invention of sexuality has a history as an idea, rooted mainly, obviously, in 19th century sexology. In other times and other cultures, the understanding of sexuality may be different. It may, for example, be based on whether you wish to be active or passive, regardless of whether it's men or women you want to have sex with. So object choice, in other words, is not always the defining measure.